Welcome all viewers to our channel. We are glad to see you here, where we share amazing stories from people's lives. Each of you is important to us, and we will be interested to know what country and city you are from. Please write about it in the comments. Now let's move on to our first story. William Harper's estate stood on the edge of the city, where poverty was replaced by a gleaming facade of upscale neighborhoods. It was like a monument to injustice, a symbol of how wealth could be built on the misery of others. Massive gates with wrought iron patterns, glittering with gilt, shielded the entire complex from the outside world. No one could even look beyond this gate. The high brick walls with spikes at the top screened out casual glances, as if to emphasize that this world was not for everyone. A long alley lined with cypresses and rose bushes led to the main house. It was so perfect that it seemed painted. When guests' cars drove by, the wheels rode softly on the smooth gravel, making no sound so as not to disturb the idle. The house itself stood at the end of the alley, like a crown of wealth and power. The snow-white marble facade shone in the sun, and the tall columns reminded of the grandeur of ancient Greek temples. In the evening, when the sun went down, the house was illuminated with warm golden light, reflected in the huge panoramic windows. Inside, the house was even more impressive. The floors were covered with the rarest Italian marble, which shone like a mirror. On the walls hung paintings by old masters Rembrandt, Vermeer, Goya. Each painting was worth millions, but Harper liked to say they were just small touches in the interior. A giant crystal chandelier in the living room hung from a ceiling 2 stories high, illuminating every detail, from the hand-carved furniture to the expensive Persian rugs. In the center stood a grand piano, which Harper joked was just a decoration because no one in the house knew how to play it. On the walls hung pictures of Harper with influential people, senators, bankers, even actors. He liked to surround himself with such pictures to show how important he was. For guests, his home was the perfect place for lavish parties, where champagne flowed like a river and the caterers moved like shadows, silent and inconspicuous. But behind this splendor lurked a dark truth. Harper wasn't just rich. He was cruel. His fortune was built on fraud, buying houses from poor families for a pittance, and then reselling them for huge sums. Many of those he evicted ended up on the streets, but that didn't bother Harper. He believed that the poor were just losers who were to blame for their own plight. Those working in the house felt this atmosphere of power and fear. No one dared to cross him. Any mistake could cost him his job and sometimes his reputation. Harper had a special look that made everyone uncomfortable, cold as ice, full of contempt. Among those who worked for him was Eliza, a young black woman who worked as a cleaner. She knew every room of the huge house, but she didn't feel any warmth in it. Every morning, as she entered through the back service entrance, she saw luxuries that were beyond the reach of her and her children. Every room, every detail of the interior reminded her that she was only a guest here, and an unwanted one at that. Elisa often wondered how one person could live in such splendor when so many were barely making ends meet. Her own home, a small apartment in a poor neighborhood, was the complete opposite of this place. The ceiling in her house was long overdue for repair. The floors creaked, and the furniture had seen better days. Her paycheck was barely enough to pay the bills and buy food for the 2 children she was raising alone. Harper had never noticed her as a person. To him, she was just another servant, part of the machinery that supported his lavish lifestyle. Sometimes he even forgot her name, calling her simply the cleaning lady or worse, that woman. Eliza tolerated it. She had no choice. Losing this job would mean losing everything she had left. But that day, when she once again entered through the back door to begin her shift, she didn't yet know that her world was about to come crashing down. Eliza Rogers lived in a tiny apartment on the top floor of a dilapidated building in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods. The walls were cracked, The ceiling sometimes leaked, and the neighbors often threw raucous parties that lasted until the wee hours of the morning. However, this place was her only refuge. She lived here with her two children, 9-year-old James, who loved to draw, and 6-year-old Amara, who loved to read picture books. Eliza was a single mom. Her husband had left them when Amara was a baby. He had simply gone out for bread one morning and never returned. She tried to find him, first out of desperation, then to get him to take at least some responsibility. But after months of searching and frustration, she realized she was alone. Her dreams were always simple. She didn't want to be rich or famous, but she wanted to give her children something she didn't have as a child: stability, education, and the feeling that they were as good as anyone else. She grew up in a similar neighborhood, in a similar apartment. Her mother worked 3 jobs to support the family, and Elise vowed that when she grew up, her children would live differently. But life was proving to be cruel. Working one job wasn't enough to cover rent, bills, school supplies, and food. Her days were scheduled to the minute, getting up at 5 in the morning to make breakfast for her children and take them to school, driving across town on a bus that reeked of gasoline and was crowded with people to get to Harper Manor on time. There a day of humiliation and hard physical labor awaited her. Harper was not the only source of her misery. The other house staff, most of whom were white, treated her with outright contempt. "You know, cleaners like you can hardly afford to even breathe near things like this marble floor," Harper's personal assistant once told her when she saw Eliza cleaning the floors. Every night when she returned home, Eliza dreamed of a better life. She imagined James becoming an architect and Amara becoming a doctor. These dreams sustained her in her most difficult moments. She was willing to endure pain, humiliation, and endless recriminations if it meant her children would have a chance to escape poverty. But her fortitude didn't mean she was invulnerable. Often, when she closed the door of her tiny bathroom, she would let herself slip and cry without anyone seeing, crying from fatigue, from hopelessness, from resentment. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a face that was aging too fast, dark circles under her eyes, wrinkles on her forehead, weathered skin. One day, when Amara came up to her, with a notebook drawn with colored pencils and said, "Mom, I want to become a scientist to make you rich," Eliza felt something inside her shrink. She stroked her daughter's head and smiled, though tears glistened in her eyes. "You'll definitely become a scientist," she whispered, hugging her. But deep inside, she knew that every day was getting harder. The wages at Harper Manor were meager, and more work was needed. Sometimes she had to sacrifice buying new clothes for the kids to pay the electric bill. Sometimes she skipped lunches to make sure the children had enough to eat. One day James' school started a charity program where they had to bring money for textbooks for poor children. When his teacher asked why he hadn't brought anything, James quietly replied, "Because I am the poor kid." Eliza heard about it from a neighbor who worked at the school, and her heart was breaking. She knew she was doing her best, but she felt it would never be enough. But a faint spark of hope continued to burn inside her. Maybe she could save enough money to enroll Amara in a good school or help James buy his first real paints. Maybe her children would break free of this vicious cycle after all. Eliza always said to herself, "Patience. For their sake, I'll endure anything." But she didn't know yet that her patience was about to develop a huge crack. Every day as Eliza crossed the black service entrance of Harper Manor, she felt invisible shackles constricting her body. This entrance, hidden behind the building next to the garbage cans, seemed tailor-made to keep the workers mindful of their place. There were no wide doors that welcomed visitors from the gravel alley, no gorgeous wrought iron handles, just a narrow, creaky passageway leading into a world of hard labor. Work started early in the morning. Eliza was the first to arrive on the grounds. Her workday began with cleaning the rooms that Harper and his guests had turned into chaos the night before. Alcohol stains on the expensive carpets, spilled wine on the marble floors, dirty shoe prints on the white couches, all of it had to be cleaned up before the owner woke up. Eliza knew she was expected to do the impossible. She was not allowed to use the main staircase of the house. There was another route for people like her, a narrow, dark one through the back hallway. She was often forced to carry heavy buckets of water upstairs because the elevator was for guests and family. But even that was a small thing compared to the humiliation she felt. Harper almost never addressed her by name. He would just say, "Hey, you, or, girl." It didn't matter to him that Elise was 33 years old and a mother of 2. To him, she was just a function. "Girl," he said one day as he walked by, "you should at least smile once in a while. It's hard to look at your sour face." Eliza pressed her lips tightly together to keep from answering. She knew that any word against him could mean dismissal, and that was tantamount to disaster. Harper didn't just demand cleanliness. He expected his employees to be invisible. They were to clean their rooms and leave without being seen by him. But if he noticed the slightest flaw, punishment was inevitable. One day, as Eliza was polishing the desk in the study, Harper burst into the room. His face was flaming with anger. "What's that?" He pointed to a tiny spot on the glass surface that she hadn't had time to wipe off. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harper. I'll fix it right away," she replied quickly, grabbing a rag. "Will you fix it?" His voice went up an octave. "Do you know how much this desk is worth? More than you'll make in a lifetime. If I see one more mark, I'll take it out of your paycheck." Her paycheck was already miserable. Deductions for mistakes meant she had to spend weeks counting every penny to buy her children food. But worst of all was the attitude of the other employees. Some of them, such as Linda, Harper's personal assistant, took pleasure in humiliating Elise. "You know, you're lucky they let you work here at all," Linda said one day, propping her feet up on an expensive leather chair in the office. "People like you don't usually get a chance." Eliza wanted to ask, "Like me?" But deep down she knew the answer. Linda had made joking remarks about her skin color and her accent more than once, even though Eliza had been born in the same town as everyone else. "Do you realize you work in the house of a man who donated millions to charity?" Linda added with a wry smile. "Maybe you should thank Mr. Harper for letting you here at all." Eliza remained silent, clutching the rag so hard her nails dug into her palms. She put up with it all because she knew she had no other choice. It was almost impossible to find a job. She had already tried at every interview. She was told that she didn't have enough experience or simply didn't call back. Every time she came home after an exhausting day, her children greeted her with joy. Amara would jump into her arms and James would talk about his drawings. Those moments were the only light in her life. But one day, as she sat on the floor folding clean clothes, James asked, "Mom, why are you so tired? You're always like this." Eliza looked up at him. There was sincerity in his eyes, and a childlike incomprehension. She smiled, though her insides burned with pain. "I just want you and Amara to be happy," she replied. She didn't tell him that her happiness came at the cost of the humiliation she suffered every day. That every time she walked through the back door, she felt less than human. She never showed them her tears, so they wouldn't see how much she had to endure for their future. But deep down, she knew her powers were not infinite. The day began like any other. Eliza, waking up at 5 in the morning, quickly made the children's beds, packed their breakfasts, and sent them off to school. Then, as always, she took the shaky bus to Harper Manor. The heavy backpack full of cleaning supplies was weighing on her shoulders, but that wasn't what was weighing on her. The moral strain was getting worse by the day. As soon as she entered through the back entrance, Linda, Harper's assistant, met her with a skewed face. "Late again," she shouted in a broken voice, even though Elise had arrived at 7 sharp. "If you think you can get away with anything here, think twice." Eliza didn't answer anything, only lowered her head. Over the years, she had learned to extinguish the emotions within her like a flame in an empty room. Her main concern was to finish the day and go home. That day, she had a special assignment to clean the living room where William Harper planned to host his business associates. The living room was one of the most luxurious places in the house. Tall floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the room with sunlight. Paintings worth a fortune hung on the walls. And in the center of the room, on a massive mahogany table, stood a collection of porcelain figurines. These figurines had always frightened Elise. Their fragility and obvious costliness made her uneasy. Harper had once said that they came from France and each one cost more than she would earn in 10 years. "They are masterpieces," he said proudly. "People like you can hardly understand their value." Today she had to dust off each of them. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the first statue. It was a porcelain shepherd with delicate fingers and minute details. She carefully wiped it with a soft cloth and set it back down, then picked up the second one. But as she reached for the third, her sleeve caught the corner of the table. The statue of a ballerina with her arm gracefully outstretched shook. It had all happened too fast. She reached out to grab it, but didn't have time. The ballerina hit the edge of the table and fell to the floor, shattering into several large pieces. Elise frowned. Her heart pounded so loudly that she thought the sound filled the room. For a few seconds, she didn't even have enough air to breathe. "What's that noise?" a harsh voice sounded. Harper appeared in the living room doorway with a cup of coffee in his hands. He looked at the floor, then at Eliza. His face turned pale, then crimson with rage. "Do you realize what you've done?" he shouted, pointing at the broken statue. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harper. It was an accident." Her voice shook. "An accident?" His shout got louder. "It was worth more than you. Do you realize how much I had to pay for it?" Elise lowered her head. She didn't know what to say. "I'll take it out of your paycheck," he growled. "You'll work here for free until you pay for the damage." Her eyes filled with tears. She realized that this debt would never be repaid. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harper. I. Shut up," he shouted, coming closer. "Do you even think when you're working? Or is it beyond you?" Every word cut her like a knife. He spoke so loudly that everyone in the neighboring rooms could probably hear him, but no one interfered. Linda only flashed into the hallway with a smirk on her face. Elise remained silent. She knew that if she tried to object, things would only get worse. She knelt down, picking up the shards. Her fingers trembled, and one of the sharp edges of the porcelain cut her hand. A thin trickle of blood appeared on her palm, but she didn't even feel the pain. "Put that away right now," Harper hissed, "and make this room as shiny as my shoes." When he left, Elise remained sitting on the floor. Her hands were still shaking, and tears ran down her cheeks. She felt tiny, as if she were broken into shards like the statue. This moment became for her a symbol of her entire life in this house, fragile, full of fear and humiliation. Every mistake she made, like a broken statue, had consequences she could not control. But inside, despite the pain and despair, a spark of something new began to grow. She didn't yet realize whether it was anger, determination, or desperation ready to turn into action. That fragile moment was the beginning of the end of her patience. The next day began with an icy silence. Eliza was depressed after the incident with the statue, but she tried to hold on. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she never expected her morning to start with another humiliation. Harper appeared in the lobby in an impeccably pressed suit, his face scowling and his gaze razor-sharp. There wasn't a speck of dust on his boots, and he had the aura of a man accustomed to total obedience. He walked over to Linda, whispered something to her, and then she gave Eliza a predatory look. "Ew," Linda shouted. "Mr. Harper wants to see you in his office, immediately." Eliza felt a chill run down her spine. She already knew it didn't bode well. Harper's office had always seemed intimidating to her. High ceilings, a massive oak desk, leather-bound books on the shelves, paintings of hunting scenes. This office was a reflection of his power and authority, and today it looked especially formidable. "Come in," Harper said, sitting at his desk. His voice was calm but threatening. Eliza walked in, trying not to show fear. "Do you know why you're here?" His voice became sharper. "Yes, Mr. Harper," she replied, trying to speak calmly. "You think apologizing is going to fix everything?" He stood up, resting his hands on the table. His figure towered over her like a shadow. "You broke one of the most valuable things in this house." "It was an accident." "Sure, I was trying to." Trying?" He interrupted her, almost shouting. "Accidents happen when people are careless. Do you know how much that statue is worth?" Eliza lowered her gaze. "Oh, sure. $100,000, he said, enjoying watching her reaction. Her eyes widened. $100,000 was more than she'd ever imagined in her entire life. "And you think your 'I'm sorry' is going to make a difference?" His voice sounded like a whip, and every word hurt. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harper. Can I, what can you do?" His voice grew louder and louder. "You think you can work it off? How much do you make?" $50 a day. "It would take you 20 years to pay me back that amount. And that's assuming you don't eat a piece of bread." Eliza felt tears start to come to her eyes, but she didn't let herself cry. "I'll do my best to fix it." "Sure," she said with difficulty. "Everything possible." Harper smirked, his face contorted into a contemptuous smile. "You should be thanking fate that I didn't fire you right away. Do you know how many people want to work here?" Eliza remained silent. She knew that every word could be used against her. "You're a nobody, you know," he continued. "You're just a cleaning lady. Your job is to clean up after me and make sure I never notice your presence. You'd even manage to screw that up." He walked around the table and stood across from her. "Look at me," he demanded. She looked up. Her eyes met his cold, contemptuous gaze. "Do you even realize how insignificant you are?" His voice was quiet but full of venom. "People like you should be thanking me for giving you a chance to earn something." Elise felt anger begin to boil inside her. These words, this attitude, were the last straw for her. "Sir," she began, but he interrupted her. "Shut up," he shouted. "You will only speak when I say you can." Her breathing became heavier. She stared at this man who seemed to take pleasure in her humiliation. "All you'll do is keep working and hope I don't find a reason to get rid of you," he said, turning away to the window. Elise stood silent. A cocktail of anger, shame, and despair bubbled inside her. She clenched her fists, trying to control herself. "Get out," he threw without turning around. She walked out of the office, feeling her legs pumping. Tears finally began to flow down her cheeks, but she quickly wiped them away as she passed Linda, who was watching her with a smug smile. That day was Elise's moment of truth. She couldn't take it anymore. Something in her began to change, as if a crack had appeared inside her, ready to release all the pain and anger she'd been holding back for so long. Eliza spent the night without sleep. Harper's voice echoed in her head, repeating the humiliating words. "You're a nobody. You should be grateful for the very fact that you work here." She sat her day in the dark, staring at the sleeping children, trying to hold back tears so she wouldn't wake them. Despair and anger bubbled in her chest, but there seemed no way out of this situation. The next day, a new blow awaited her. As soon as she entered through the service entrance, Linda stopped her with an expression of mock satisfaction. "Mr. Harper wants to see you again. Go to the office, but be warned, he's particularly unhappy today." Eliza felt a chill run down her back. Her legs felt like cotton, but she forced herself to walk. The office door was ajar, and Harper's voice could already be heard inside. "Come in," he said, not even looking up from the papers on the table. Eliza walked in and stopped at the threshold. "Close the door." She obeyed, feeling the room grow crowded with his icy aura. "I thought about your little mistake," he began, finally looking up. "I decided that a reprimand wasn't enough." He stepped closer, leaving his checkbook on the table. "It's a simple situation. You owe me, and I want that debt paid." Eliza frowned. "But, sure, I don't have that kind of money," she muttered, her voice trembling. Harper smirked, like a predator cornering prey. "That's not my problem. You work here to fulfill your duties, and if you can't, you have to make amends." He stepped back to the bar in the corner of the study, poured himself a whiskey, and took a sip. "I'll give you a month to find the money you don't want to pay. Then you can forget about your job." "Sure, please. I have children." Eliza tried to appeal to his humanity, but it was as if her words didn't reach him. "Kids?" he snorted. "Maybe you should have thought about them before you broke things." His tone was cold, and there wasn't an ounce of compassion in his eyes. "How much do I owe?" she asked quietly, even though she knew she was about to hear an exorbitant sum. $100,000. Eliza barely stayed on her feet. "But it's impossible." "Maybe," he interrupted, "you just have to be resourceful." He stepped closer, hovering over her. "Or maybe you're hoping I'll turn a blind eye, that I'll do you a favor." His voice became low and threatening. "Nobody here gets anything for nothing. If you don't have money, find a way to get it, or you'll have other problems." Eliza realized he wasn't joking. His words were so cynical that her insides clenched. "Do you understand me?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper, but that made it even more frightening. "Yes, sure," she replied, barely holding back tears. "All right, you've got a month. If you don't find the money by then, I'll have to take action." He turned away, signaling that the conversation was over. Eliza left the office feeling as if her soul had been squeezed to the last drop. Linda was standing nearby, as usual, a gloating smile on her face. "And how's our little conversation going?" she asked venomously. Eliza didn't answer anything, just walked past, feeling the ball of pain and rage growing inside her. She knew that Harper had put her in this situation on purpose. He knew she had no chance of paying that amount of money, and he was enjoying her desperation. This ultimatum wasn't just a demand for money, it was a show of power, an attempt to break her completely. Eliza went back to her work, but her hands were shaking. She dusted, scrubbed the floors, and waxed the furniture, but her thoughts kept returning to Harper's words. What would he do if I couldn't pay? It was a question that she couldn't stop asking. For the first time in a long time, she began to ask herself another question. How much longer can I take this? A few days after Harper's ominous ultimatum, the situation changed dramatically. The morning began as usual. Elisa came to work, exhausted from sleepless nights and thoughts of where to get the money. She knew her time was running out, but she hadn't been able to come up with a single solution in the past days. As she was scrubbing the floors in the hall, Linda came down the stairs. She had papers in her hands and an impenetrable mask on her face. "You need to go to the study," she said briefly. Eliza nodded, but inside her everything turned upside down. She knew that nothing good was to be expected. In his office, Harper sat at his massive desk, casually flipping through some documents. When Eliza entered, he looked up and looked at her with an expression of cold contempt. "Sit down," he said, pointing to a chair in front of his desk. She obeyed, feeling her heart pounding in her chest. "I've been thinking about your situation," he began, leaning back in his chair. "I've come to the conclusion that it doesn't make sense to keep you here any longer." Eliza frowned. "But sir, please, I need this job." Her voice was weak, but she tried to speak calmly. "Need?" He snorted, as if he didn't believe her words. "You know, Elisa, you're a liability. I hired you to do your job perfectly, not to cause problems." "I'm doing the best I can." She tried to object, but he interrupted her. "Anything you can do." He stood up abruptly, walking around the table. "You broke an expensive statue. You show a complete disrespect for the order I've established here, and now you expect me to put up with it?" His voice filled the room, and Elisa felt her body tense up. "Mr. Harper, please think of my children," she began, barely holding back tears. "About your children?" Harper grinned. "That's not my problem. If you can't take care of your family, it's your fault, not mine." His words were like knives stabbing into her heart. "I'll give you 2 weeks to leave this house, but I want you to know that you don't work here anymore." His tone was unrelenting. "But, please," her voice trailed off. "Don't waste my time, Elisa," he interrupted, once again indicating that the conversation was over. "Go away." Eliza walked out of the office, feeling her world crumbling. She walked past Linda, who stood in the hallway with an expression of gloating triumph on her face. "So, no luck?" she asked with a venomous sneer. Elisa didn't answer. She walked silently toward the closet where her belongings were stored. Her hands trembled as she gathered her belongings. She didn't know how to tell her children that now they had no means of livelihood. As she walked through the front door, Harper appeared in the hall. "Remember, you don't stand a chance. People like you never rise above their position. Resistance is futile," he said, looking her straight in the eye. Eliza couldn't hold back any longer. She turned sharply and looked at him, her eyes blazing with anger. "You think you can do anything? That your power gives you the right to humiliate people?" Her voice trembled, but there was something new in it, a strength she hadn't expected in herself. Harper only grinned. "You talk too much. Get out before I call security." Eliza walked outside the gates of the manor, feeling devastated. Her heart was broken, but at the same time, something began to grow inside her. It was a hatred of injustice, a burning feeling that she no longer wanted to be a pawn in someone else's game. Her departure from Harper House wasn't just the end of a job. It was a symbol of her defeat in a world where people like her had no say. But that defeat was the beginning of something bigger. Eliza didn't know what would happen next, but she vowed to herself that she would never again allow anyone to treat her like a thing. Eliza stood at the gates of the Harper mansion, feeling her heart clench with pain and humiliation. Leaving was hard, but she couldn't afford to give up her belongings. It was all she had left, the only thing that would be of any comfort to her. She couldn't go back to her poor, cold apartment with her children without those things. So many years she had given to this house, and now she was just banished like an extra element. She walked to the front door, trying not to show her weakness. A storm was raging inside her, but her face remained a mask of calm. She couldn't let herself break, even though every step she took was difficult. When the door opened, she was greeted by one of the guards, who didn't seem to remember her face, but now his gaze was cold and assessing. "What do you want?" he asked, not inviting her in. Eliza raised her head, her voice quiet but firm. "I need to get my stuff." "Not your concern," the guard replied, and his expression became even more indifferent. "Mr. Harper ordered you not to come back." Eliza felt her body clench in pain. Those words were like a spit in her face. She was here to take everything that had to do with her job, her life, and now she wasn't even allowed in like a criminal. "I'm not asking for much," I just need a few things, she said, trying to stay calm, though her chest was boiling. The guard only shrugged. In that case, you'll have to wait. We don't let anyone in here without orders. Eliza couldn't believe her ears. She was standing in front of this house that had once been her workplace, and now she wasn't even given the simple right to pick up her things. It was a humiliation she couldn't bear. She took a step forward, trying to get past the guard. "Get out," he shouted, grabbing her shoulder and pushing her back with force. "I said don't come in." The rudeness of it made her feel tears start to come to her eyes, but she held back. She wasn't going to let them see her weakness. "It's not your decision," she screamed, trying to break free. "I'm not a criminal. I have the right to get my things." But the guard was relentless. He was already pulling out his phone, apparently about to call security. Elise felt her hopes crumble one by one. "Mr. Harper ordered it," he repeated, like an incantation that was meant to end the conversation. Eliza stepped away from the door, her eyes full of pain and anger. She felt a heavy feeling of powerlessness squeezing her chest. She could no longer stand in this place where she was not only disrespected, but humiliated at every turn. She couldn't allow herself to be a part of this game. The guard still went to the phone, and Eliza, unable to bear it any longer, turned around and walked back. Each step was heavy, as if her legs lacked the strength to leave this place. As she approached the fence, her gaze fell on the corner of the house. In the window, she saw Linda standing there with a cocky expression on her face. As always, she was looking directly at Elise, as if expecting her to fall. Elise felt her inner protest blazing even stronger. Linda was another part of this world that hated her, another link in the chain that held her back. Elise wiped away her tears, but they still ran down her cheeks. She could feel her strength leaving her, but deep down she knew she couldn't give up. She must not let them break her. She couldn't let these people win. With each step she took along the fence, she felt her pride crumbling, but there was still something more to it, a desire to find the strength to keep fighting. This pain and humiliation weren't supposed to be the end of her. They were only the beginning of what she had to endure to escape this hell. When she finally got back to her car, her hands were shaking, but she didn't get into the car. She just stood there, feeling the world around her begin to fall apart, but something inside her was on fire. In that moment, she realized that nothing comes without a fight, and she wasn't going to give up this fight. Through tears and humiliation, she began to realize an important truth. If she wanted to change her life, she had to be willing to go all the way. Never before had Elise felt as hopeless as she did that day. She had thought that she could survive her dismissal, that she could somehow manage to find a job and at least provide for her children. But that day, when she wasn't allowed to pick up her belongings, was a turning point for her. The walls of this world, built of lies, hypocrisy and cruelty, began to crumble. At this time, Harper was, as always, the center of attention. His luxurious office, with paintings by internationally renowned artists on the walls, was the stage for his next stage play. His Saturday at his desk, serving expensive wine to his guests and laughing at the jokes that came from the loudspeakers in the room. Everything seemed perfect, until his son, Alex, jumped up and announced some new project his father was backing. "This is an important step for our foundation," Alex proudly announced. "Harper, as always, is helping to create better conditions for people from disadvantaged neighborhoods. He understands how important it is to support equality, to give opportunity to those at the bottom." Harper made a theatrical gesture in response, as if to raise his shoulders, as if it were something he had always wanted and aspired to. He smiled, and everyone around him applauded him like a real hero. "It's not just charity. It's our duty to society," he said, a confidence in his voice that left no room for doubt. "We have to be there for those in need. This is a step towards creating a just world. Eliza, being far away from this glamorous event, had no way of knowing that Harper had just made an announcement in which he, like a saint, announced his donation to a charity focused on promoting education for poor, oppressed minorities. It was just another act of his. He made the decision to donate, but not for actual help, but to create the image he was so fond of. It was his way of proving to the world that he was on the side of good despite everything. In reality, however, his actions went against his public statements. He was a master of pretense, and his every move was aimed at earning the sympathy of the crowd and, more importantly, attracting media attention. Harper made a pledge, a large donation, to set up training centers for people from the lower strata of society. Everyone expected his grand gesture. He gave speeches, talking about the importance of equality, the chances for people from poor neighborhoods, not forgetting to emphasize his role as a benefactor, not missing a single opportunity to say how every day he supports diversity and inclusion. "We don't just give money," he said with a bright expression on his face. "We give people a chance to change their lives. This is not an empty promise, but real work for future generations." His words sounded like music, perfect phrases for a public relationship. But Eliza knew the other side. While he boasted about his generosity to all these people, in reality Harper hadn't even let her pick up her things, hadn't even bothered to help with her difficult situation. His entire donation was nothing more than part of an elaborate media spectacle. His generosity was nothing more than a gesture for a check mark. To create the right image, he used the poor as a backdrop for his own benefit, not seeing them as people, but only as material for his own enrichment. Eliza was walking past the news program one morning when she happened to hear a report on his latest gesture. She was angry, but at the same time, she felt utterly powerless. She was one of those he so loftily referred to as the needy. However, instead of actually helping, he stood on a pedestal, handing out large sums of money with a noble smile. It was so hypocritical that Eliza could barely contain her anger. While her life became more complicated every day, Harper created a halo of virtue around himself to make up for his cruelty. He didn't see how it contrasted with reality. He did not see that while he was spending his generous donations, millions of people like Elisa were suffering from his pride and ruthlessness. Those who watched his actions from afar believed that he was a philanthropist, a man who actually cared for those in need. Eliza, however, knew the truth. She saw how he played with their lives, how he took advantage of them. To him, they were simply tools with which he could propel himself into the upper echelons of society. Then, sitting in her apartment, surrounded by children and emptiness, Elise realized she couldn't let him build that image. She couldn't look at his smiles anymore. All those false images. He was a master manipulator, but now that her life had been ruined by his hands, she knew her struggle wouldn't end. Every donation he made now seemed to her like an attempt to hide his dirty nature, and Elise realized that if she didn't fight this hypocrisy, he would win. But there was still a flame burning in her heart. The dark night squeezed everything around them. The noise of the distant city came from the streets, the light of the street lamps barely illuminating the deserted corners of the shelter, where Eliza and her children had taken temporary refuge. She sat on an old mattress that couldn't hide its ragged surface and held one of the children in her lap, her other children frouncing in the shadows, feeling the same hopelessness. There was no room for dreams in this place. There was only survival here, nothing more. She tried to comfort them, but she herself could not shake off the waves of bitterness and pain that burned her soul. Her thoughts were confused in the darkness, but one thing was clear: her life was here now, in this dismal orphanage, with children who might never see a real future. All her dreams of a better tomorrow had crumbled like a house of cards. Sitting there, in the shadow of the cold walls, She thought about how unfair the world was, how easily someone could step on people's fates without noticing them, how easily human lives could be broken for their own comfort and gain. She thought of Harper, of how easily he had judged her, pretending to be a benefactor, handing out his money and promises as if that would solve all problems, and it all seemed so empty, so unbearably hypocritical. Eliza closed her eyes, trying to suppress the feelings that were rushing out, but her chest was seething. The anger she'd been holding back was growing stronger. It wasn't going away. It wouldn't go away. It was burning her from the inside out, burning away all attempts to come to terms with this world. She thought of Harper sitting in his luxurious apartment, surrounded by flowers and flattering words, knowing nothing of the people whose lives he'd destroyed. He didn't see her pain, or the pain of others like her children, like no one else. Where is the justice? She asked herself over and over again, feeling the shadows in her soul tearing at her words. How could she stay alive? How could she be strong for her children when the whole world was turning out to be so cruel? Where are those who were supposed to help her, whom she trusted? She remembered the days when she first came to work at Harper's house. She had been full of hope, believing that here, in this luxurious place, her life could change. Now all she saw was a lie. She was just a tool, a temporary addition in the lives of people who didn't truly see her or appreciate her labor. In those moments, Elisa felt her body clench in spasms of despair, and the only thing she could do was hold her children tighter to her. They didn't understand everything that was happening, but they felt it. She saw the same shadow appear in their eyes that was in her own, how they began to unconsciously fear that tomorrow might not be the same as yesterday. What do they want with us? She thought. Why do I, like everyone else who finds themselves at the bottom, have to be victimized by this system? Why does the world work this way? She looked up, looked at her children, and her heart clenched with pain. Those little faces, their trusting eyes, it was all she had to give to this world. And yet, her life was just a game for people who could get rid of her at any time. This is not what I live for, she told herself, feeling the fierce rush of emotion making her heart beat faster. I can't go on like this. These thoughts were tearing at her soul, but there was also something more to them, a desire to fight. Eliza didn't know what to do next, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't let this world win. She couldn't let her children live in a world where they would be nothing more than extras in someone else's games. Eliza clutched her children in her arms again, and in that moment, despite all the pain, she felt a small spark ignite, a spark of struggle. I will fight as long as I can. I will fight for you, for their future, for this world to change just a little bit. The sounds of the night didn't stop, but there was a firm resolve in her heart, despite everything she'd been through, and in her silent cry, there was something more than just despair. It was a cry for the truth, for the people, for her children, for herself. Eliza walked down the street, her soul in chaos. The faces of the passers-by were the same as they always were, blank, indifferent, going somewhere without noticing those who were suffering. It seemed as if the whole world believed in one truth, a truth that was created on camera, on the glossy pages of magazines, on billboards that made people like Harper look like heroes. But Eliza knew the truth. She knew that behind those facades of nobility lay a brutal reality in which people like her became mere pawns in someone else's game. Her thoughts went back to Harper. He was a master of manipulation, an artist of lies. He was the one who creates in society the perfect image of a great philanthropist, a philanthropist who fights for equality, for the welfare of the poor. He was the man who gives money away to charity, who talks about his desire to change the world with a smile on his face. But Eliza knew it was all just an act. Harper wasn't the man he was trying to appear to be. He was just part of a system that used power and money to oppress those who couldn't afford it. Everything he did was not motivated by compassion, but by a desire to maintain his power. His donations were not an act of kindness, but simply a way to stay on the pedestal longer, to be visible for the cameras, to attract media attention. His actions were not intended to actually help. They were aimed at preserving his image, at creating the illusion that he cares about those who do not have access to power and wealth. He gave money, but he did not seek solutions to systemic problems. He was only one link in a chain that kept the poor in his sphere, giving them only illusions. Eliza couldn't stand it. She knew that people like Harper would always find ways to manipulate those who were vulnerable. He wasn't the only one. There were many in their world who displayed their generosity in public, but actually used power to pinch those who couldn't defend themselves. These people pretended to be fighting for the truth, for the rights of others, but in reality, they were only strengthening their power by pushing down those who were weaker. She often wondered how people like Harper could live so easily with their actions, with their lies, how they could look in the mirror, knowing that behind their expensive suits and fake smiles lurked something else entirely. Harper spoke of equality, but he couldn't even recognize the person who stood before him as an equal. To him, Eliza was just a janitor, just a servant whose existence didn't matter as long as her labor didn't benefit him. He was willing to sit on the throne of his wealth, to rule with his money and connections, but never realized that true equality did not require ostentatious gestures. Eliza knew that he would never realize how unfair his actions were. He would never see the people whose lives he was destroying because they were simply invisible to him. Harper and people like him didn't consider her, like thousands of others, worthy of respect. To them, she was just part of the background, necessary to continue their illusion of success and prosperity. But Eliza couldn't stay silent any longer. She could no longer let these people define her place in this world. She began to realize that her life should not be subject to such standards, such double standards. She decided that she would not remain in the shadows. A door opened in her soul, and behind it she saw a whole world in which she could fight. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that Harper and people like him wouldn't give up without a fight, but her eyes were full of determination. She often thought about what she would do next. Someday she would return to Harper to give him everything he deserved. She would fight, despite the fact that he would use his power, despite the fact that the whole world might turn against her. She will fight not only for herself, but for those who remain in the shadows, those whose names no one knows. She was determined that she would not allow him and his kind to continue their game. She wasn't going to be just a tool in someone else's hands. Harper was not her master. She was her own destiny. And that fight would start with her refusing to be part of the system that was eating them all up. Eliza was ready to break free of that chain, to no longer be invisible, to no longer be part of the double standard they were trying to force her to adhere to. The darkness in which Eliza found herself was almost impenetrable. Time and again, as the darkness of night fell on her shoulders like a heavy, merciless weight. But despite this, a faint spark continued to burn within her, a spark that even in her darkest moments, when it seemed to her that all was lost, could not be extinguished. This spark, as the only source of light, she carried through all her trials, all the humiliation, all the violence she had to endure, a spark that reminded her that she was still alive, that she was still fighting. She sat in a corner of the cheap shelter, where the smell of damp and old age permeated every cell of her body. The children slept nearby, her oldest daughter curled up in a ball, and the youngest, still uncomprehending, stirring restlessly in her sleep. Eliza couldn't allow herself to cry. It wasn't the kind of weakness that could break her. Instead, she thought again about what Harper had done with her life, how he had easily thrown her away like a worthless thing, just because she didn't have the status, the value held by those who held money and power. He thought, "I'd give up," she told herself. He thought I'd stay here, in this filthy shelter, forever. But Eliza wasn't ready to give up. She knew that her life was more than just a statistic. She realized that every step she took now mattered, that every choice she made, every decision she made could change her future and the future of her children. And even though there was a giant barrier in front of her, a system that had been built over centuries she could no longer stand by. What if it wasn't just my struggle? What if I can become something more? What if I can help others? These questions swirled in her mind, and she felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. But at the same time, she knew that the journey would be difficult, that there would be much pain, more fear and humiliation waiting for her. She thought of the way Harper looked at her, as if she were a disenfranchised laborer who could just be tossed on the sidelines of life. She knew there were hundreds like her, thousands, millions. These people are overlooked, but she decided that her fight would not just be for herself, but for all those who remain invisible in this cruel world. It would be her revenge, not just on Harper, but on the whole system. Something changed inside her. It wasn't just a desire for revenge. It was a desire to change everything, a desire to destroy this world, where people like her become just a part of the inexorable machine that creates other people's fates. She began to realize that even in the most hopeless situations, people have strength, the power to resist, the power to survive, the power to fight, and most importantly, the power to dream. I will fight. I will fight for my children. I will fight for the sake of others who can't make it. I will fight for justice, she whispered to herself, like an incantation, like a vow. She knew the path would be unequal. She knew that she would face those who would try with every step to suppress her, to break her will. But now that she realized that her life was her right, her choice, her opportunity, she felt ready to go all the way. The faint spark inside her burned brighter with each new realization. And though this world was still full of cruelty, hypocrisy, betrayal, and fear, Eliza realized that she was the one who could change it. Not the system itself, not the authorities, only those who are no longer afraid, those who stay alive even in the darkest corners of the world. She stood up, looking around her small, almost empty rooms, where there was no new beginning yet, but there was a future. She knew she would fight on, despite everything, for her children, for herself, and for everyone who could no longer find the strength within themselves to resist. It wasn't just a fight for rights, it was a fight for life, for dignity, for the present. Hope didn't fade, it didn't fade, it only grew brighter and brighter, despite everything that was happening around her. Even though the world was full of hopelessness, Eliza felt a fire burning in her heart that would not go out, and that fire will become her strength. Thank you for your attention and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again.